welcome to the Petey Performance Podcast. Just going to shift my microphone into position there for you. So a solo podcast today, guys, and I put up on my Instagram that I was going to do a Q&A episode. So I got a lot of rubbish, to be honest, on the Q&A, like people taking the piss, asking me pretty funny questions that I wouldn't be comfortable answering on the podcast at the moment. But I did get one very, very good question from a fellow strength and conditioning coach who I used to work with, Paddy Quinlan, who I'll give a shout out. He's working with rugby teams and GAA teams down the country in Tipperary, as well as doing nutrition with online clients and whatnot, as well as programming with various sports, powerlifting, etc. And he asked me if I would be so kind as to go through our in-season structure at the moment and how that is looking with Thomas Davis, who I'm working with, obviously. And he said maybe that's a podcast in itself, I suppose. And luckily enough, it is probably a podcast in itself, but because I did not get a whole pile of serious questions, Paddy, for your benefit, I'm going to go through what we do on a weekly basis during our in-season. So obviously I'm involved in the club and I work with a number of different teams out there, but I will go through what I do with both the men's and the ladies teams. I suppose that will be of benefit to other coaches who are working in GAA. It is an incredibly tough and complicated sport to work with, as is the case with a lot of team sport athletes, because the sport is so far removed from what we do as S&C coaches. So we've got to try and reverse engineer the demands of the sport and prepare the athletes for the demands of the sport and to hopefully improve their performance in time. But the number one thing with all Gaelic Games players, because the volumes are so high, the training schedule is so high, they're amateur athletes and they have a job as well as playing a very, very intense sport and having a tough schedule where they may play more than 30 matches in a season. They're going to have other stressors that are going to impact on their recovery and the time that they can give to their sport. So I have a kind of a structure or a coaching kind of process that I go through that I've kind of developed, and I've integrated many different models in together to use it, but I'm going to go through it for you here. And basically, I've kind of, like all good coaches do, I've stolen from a number of very, very good coaches who are a lot better than me and who have very good coaching processes or systems. And I've kind of integrated them together to hopefully try and impact the players, impact the athletes, and impact the team overall to lead to some positive and successful results in time. So it is very, very important, obviously, that we try to first do no harm when we're programming for athletes in team sports, because the number one thing for those athletes is always going to be performance in their sport. So we can't overstep the mark as S&C coaches, as performance practitioners, but we can have an impact on performance by allowing them to train more and play more frequently, by hopefully avoiding some chronic and acute injuries, which basically a lot of that comes down to not doing anything stupid at the wrong times. Well, not stupid, but not going too intense with the training volumes and intensities at the wrong times. It's hard at times with athletes in Gaelic Games because they may be required to play with a number of different teams. Dual sport athletes are another conundrum, and we have a number in our club that play both sports. And the good thing is I have, and my team has, an open dialogue with the coaching teams of both sports, and we use GPS, that sport specifically, to track their running volumes and intensities, so we can get a fairly concrete picture of what they're doing on a weekly basis. As you all know, I have a bit of a speed bias in terms of how I think about sport, team sport specifically. If you're a running-based sport, then the majority of the sport and the majority of the important actions in the sport are going to come from running or sprinting. So it makes sense that we develop those skills and we make the athletes robust enough to tolerate high running volumes and high running velocities. And if we can get them to run at higher and improved speeds, then hopefully that will impact in performance. Now, obviously, it's a multi-directional game as well, so they need to be able to change direction, decelerate, accelerate, reaccelerate, and perceive what's going on in the game as well. So there's a number of different things that play into that. But obviously, if we want to allow them to be able to have all these movement options in the sport, they're going to have to be strong enough and have a high level of eccentric strength in order to be able to tolerate the increased running speeds and then the decelerations at those increased running speeds. So we're going to have to work on both. So how we structure the week then is generally we'll have 2 to 3 training days. If we have a game, we'll only have 2 training days. I usually pick one of those days to focus on linear speed and one of those days to focus on change of direction. Because of my speed bias, I have integrated kind of a high-low model into training, and I've used a high-low training method kind of methodology as has come from Charlie Francis, and Keir Winham-Flatt has done some great stuff with Strength Coach Network explaining how he uses that in a team sport setting, and I've tried to apply that into a Gaelic Games setting. I try to get the athletes up to the pitch not a huge amount of times in a week, because I think, and it is an element of the culture of GAA, that you see yourself and your whole identity as a Gaelic Games athlete or as a footballer or hurler, and that's all that you do. And there's inherent sacrifices that come with that, but you don't want there to be too many sacrifices that the athletes start resenting the fact they have to be up at the field. As well as that, obviously we're up at the field to improve. But if we can improve the quality of the training and the intensity of the training and then allow more time away from the field to recover, we'll hopefully get better adaptation in relation to the qualities that we're trying to develop. So my theory on that is, rather than getting the athletes up to the pitch to do pitch and gym sessions on separate days, I like to get our pitch session done and then our gym session done afterwards, and then have a full day of recovery or active recovery on the following day. If they want to do an upper body session themselves the following day, perfectly fine. That will be still termed as a low training day, because they're not going to accumulate enough fatigue that will be termed as global fatigue. Well, not from what I see anyway, unless they're doing a huge bodybuilding style program and they're in the gym for greater than an hour and a half, which I don't see happening an awful lot. Our gym is up at the pitch as well, so I try to encourage the players to come up, get the work done, and then get away from the pitch and go spend time with your friends and family away from the sport, so that you have a life outside of the sport. Something I should probably get better at. If you've listened to the last podcast, I'm trying in that regard for sure, but there are demands of this job that you probably need to be present more than you're not present. And I definitely like to be present to show that I'm investing in the athletes and investing in their development by giving them my time. I do probably need to take the odd day off and practice what I preach there, and I will endeavour to do that in the next few weeks as we continue in the championship season. So we will do our pitch session. So if we have a Tuesday, for example, we might do linear speed as a part of the warm-up, as a microdose in the warm-up. We will go through some dynamic mobility. Then we'll go into maybe our rudiment hops, some drills that I've picked that for that day and that level of progression that we're at. Like, we started at the start of the season on fairly, like, last year we would have probably done the general drills you see from everyone. You probably would do your A skips, you might do your B skips, you might do some plyo bounds, you might do some straight leg bounds. And I think everybody does them, and people are used to doing those drills in their warm-ups. And that's not to say they're not useful, but I just found that if you do those drills consistently, it becomes a little bit passive and the athletes don't have to think about what they're doing as much. So I started to increase the complexity of the drills over the season, and we started going into some double switches, boom booms or triple switches. We started going into other plyo variations and running mechanic variations that they definitely found challenging at the beginning, but you want them to find them challenging, because if they're not finding them somewhat challenging, then they're not learning anything, and we're not probably getting any adaptation at all. Well, you might get minimal adaptation, but we're probably just warming up for the session. But we have minimal time to work on these things. We might get 10, 15 minutes at the start of the session. So we want to be as effective as we can in that warm up. And like realistically, after 3 minutes, their body temperature is going to be up anyway. So I can focus on getting what I need out of that warm up in relation to developing physical qualities, rather than simply warming up the athlete to reduce the risk of injury. We're kind of killing two birds with one stone and doing both. So after we do our drills, then we might move on to some linear speed exposure, some max speed exposure, or 90 to 95% of their max speed generally is what they get up to. Very few of them will hit 100% there. But if I want them to run a little bit faster and have a little bit greater intent, we might do some chasing games to add a competitive element. And when we add the competitive element, the enjoyment factor goes up, the intent goes up, and I just get a lot more out of the training, I suppose. Now, that's not to say we won't do the completely focused running drills or sprint exposure as well. We will do some flying sprints. We will do some slow accelerations. We will do some sprint float sprints. We will do wickets at a certain stage of the season. We kept them in, and we will increase the complexity of those as well by adding in extra and added constraints too. Like we might on our wickets have the athletes to have a dowel in their hand, or a med ball in their hand, or a football in their hand, and hold it out from them, or switch hands. Or we may get them to switch the direction which they're facing when they're going over the wickets, to mimic a little bit of that disassociation that will happen on the field of play when you're watching the ball. But that's not where you start. You start at the most basic general, and you progress on from there. And now at this stage of the season, we will do a couple of exposures to max speed, and that might be a flying sprint, etc. But I try to integrate a lot of the linear speed work and the change of direction work that we do into game scenario drills. And I like to make it a little bit more competitive as well, because we're at the competitive stage of the season. So you want the athletes to be competitive and enjoy the competition, because you're trying to get them to do that in the games as well. You want them to enjoy the process of being challenged and trying to achieve their goal of winning the game, and ultimately moving on to the latter stages or later stages of the championship. But you don't worry about that. You're just thinking game by game, obviously. So that will be our linear speed warm up there. And then the next day, we may have a focus on maybe change of direction, and then I will integrate some game scenario things, as I said, and have a little bit of a competitive element. That may be a one-on-one scenario. I may group the athletes into teams as well to get a little bit of a collective competition going, and some togetherness, and a bit of slagging going, and a bit of crack. And I find that they can be even more competitive in that scenario, some of the athletes, than they would be on a 1v1 setting. And I think it's good to have that bit of collective like togetherness and competition, and have a bit of slagging, and you'll get that in the session as well. But I find it brings a lot of enjoyment to it. It brings a lot of connection between the players, a lot of talking, and they enjoy. That's what they play a team sport for. If they were interested solely in the 1v1s, they'd play an individual sport. They're up there to achieve a goal with their mates. And so if you can facilitate that in your warm-ups, your microdoses, etc., it's only going to lead to more enjoyment for them. And if they're enjoying it, which is the number one thing with amateur sport for sure, then they're going to hopefully play better, because they'll be in a better frame of mind. So then on another day, I typically might want to get some high-speed running volume in. And I'll probably do that on the days when I know that I can't push too hard. So I'll use some maybe extensive, probably more intensive tempo at this stage of the season, even though it won't be a huge amount of volume, just because with the intensive tempo, I can get it done a lot quicker. So it doesn't take away from time that can be spent working on tactics, technical stuff, game scenario type stuff with the sport coaches, the GAA coaches, and skills, etc. Because that's number one at this stage of the season. So we may do a rudiment hop series, and then we might move on to some high speed running, and that might happen the training session after we've played a game. So the one when we're just back in after playing a game at the weekend, because then bodies might be a little bit banged up. So doing that lower intensity warm up or microdose is probably more appropriate there, because if they're doing tempo, they're not going to get over 70% of their max speed anyway. And then we just expose them some level of plyos there too. And I might be given more time to do the warm up there as well, because the coaches are aware that they probably can only get some skill work done. Some of the athletes may be only doing part of the session. And I like to have an input on what's going on in the actual training session as well. So this is probably as good a point of ever to go through the model that I do use. And I kind of use Fergus Connolly's stuff to come up with a model that's based on the high-low model, but is also based on how we approach each session. And I try to make it as simple as possible for the sport coaches to understand what we can do on the given days. So I've color-coded each session. And then what we do is under each color-coded session, but the coaches are pretty understanding now. 1 second, I'll be back. So we are back. Sorry, apologies for the interruption. So I've color-coded the sessions, and then the athletes and the coaches know what we're going to do on that day. They'll be given a calendar of what's coming up on a weekly basis so that they have an idea what to prepare for and what to expect on that day. Then the coaches know what to program in terms of allocating different drills and games and what's appropriate for different days. So for the highest session, as you can imagine, I call that a red session. And a red session is typically going to be when the athletes have a high level of readiness. In the preseason and in the league season, we probably had more of those days than we did not, as I was trying to overreach the athletes a little bit to lead to some positive adaptation and lead to improved performance. When I see a red session, that applies to both our pitch session and our gym session. So that would be the high session that Charlie Francis would go on about, essentially. And Fergus Connolly would term it a high speed day. So on that day, the overall goal is improving the performance of high speed actions, which are the actions that are scoring actions in a game. Or it may be an action where you are preventing a score for the opposition team. We know that it's great to be fit and aerobically fit, and you've got to be able to be aerobically fit to be able to recover in between bouts of high intensity, but high intensity is where the game is won and lost. So that's the day I'll do my max speed work, and we'll go a little bit longer distance on the max speed. We'll get full recovery on those sprints, and I may go into some chasing games. I may go to some integrative kind of game speed stuff, but it will be getting the athletes up to a higher velocity than they generally will get to, and it will be focused on developmental. So we'll be getting a decent amount of high speed running. Well, not high speed running, sprint volume probably. And we'll get that in the drills as well, because in the drills, we kind of have a bit of an anaerobic focus. So we'll have high rest, and the drills will be short and sweet and fast and focused on maybe scoring or preventing a score. And the distances that they're running for those drills might be a little bit longer. So it could be finishing situations. It could be having attacking options. And we might do some contact conditioning on that day, or intensive tempo during the early parts of the season. And I might make it a little bit tougher by adding in some contact conditioning into the intensive tempo, or I might make it a little bit harder by adding in some change of direction and making it a multi-directional tempo running. So yeah, we have our games on that day as well, our small-sided games, and we'll have probably on those small-sided games will focus on the physical demands of the sport. So we might play a bit of murder ball, which I kind of robbed off Marcelo Bielsa and what he was doing with Leeds. And it's continuous. Will be balls being thrown in from all angles. We will give the lads a decent amount of rest in between games, but we'll have a number of games running. And we haven't ran that in a while now, so I can't really remember the times that we were doing on it. But they will develop a large amount of fatigue over the course of the session, and it will be quite hard on their CNS. But then after the session is finished on the pitch, we'll get straight into the gym and we will make our high days high, as they say, and we'll do our heavy compound lifts and we'll do our strength and power training. And we can basically do anything on that day as well as that, but we'll be focused mainly on getting some exposure to some higher volumes or higher loads, so close to probably greater than 80% of your 1 rep max on those compound lifts. And we're focused on developing strength, and we might be focused on developing power when we might drop that rep or that percentage down a little bit. And then we'll obviously get the curls in on that day as well. So then the next one down from that is our orange day. And on our orange day, we are focused on improving the repeatability of high-speed actions. So although the actions won't probably be at the same intensity or speed, there will be more of them. So we're improving the athlete's ability to repeat that over time. So it's essentially a conditioning day is what it is. It's not exactly going to be a high day, but it's definitely not a moderate day either. It's still going to be quite taxing for the athlete, and that might be used when a red day wouldn't be appropriate, because I might be a little bit concerned about getting them up to the same velocities that they would get in a red day. So for example, on that day, we might do some accelerations, but the longest distance that they would cover on that day is probably 50 meters. And typically on an orange day, I will throw in more integrative and change of direction or agility type games and scenarios. We might do our decels on that day. We might do some games on that day. We'll still do some contact conditioning. We can still do some anaerobic conditioning as well. But we will focus on, in our drills, even though we're focused on doing them at high speed, because we always are, there will be more repeated. So the density of the reps will probably be a little bit higher. But we won't be focused solely on getting it at high speed. We'll be focused on developing the anaerobic fitness of the athletes. And obviously when we do that, we'll concurrently develop the aerobic fitness or the aerobic conditioning of the athletes as well. So for our games on that day, we'll do more endurance games. So we might have larger spaces than we usually would, and we would have fewer players. So they'd have to cover a little bit more distance. Because they're doing that, they'd probably accumulate a little bit more running volume than they would on the red session, even though on the red session, they would definitely have more meters of sprint volume than they would on the orange session. And then we'll get a little bit more intensive and anaerobic on that tempo conditioning that we'll do as well. So we might have a down up component, and we might have a jump component, or we might have a change of direction in there in the tempo running as well. Then when we go up into the gym, we will be focused solely on our compound lift. So I won't put in any accessory work on that day really, unless one of the athletes has a bit of a niggle or has an injury and needs to work on it. Then they can make the decision to go and do that themselves, and I'll facilitate that. The red day and the orange day, they will never be close together. They will not be following each other. What we will throw after a red day or an orange day typically is a green day, and that's the day, Green Day, what a band as well. That is the day I was talking about, where we won't do much sprinting at all, but we'll do the high speed running. The tempo, extensive tempo, would be very appropriate for that. For the intensive tempo, I won't throw in a change of direction. I won't throw in any contact conditioning. I won't throw in any other anaerobic or any other movement that is going to make the running demand a little bit more anaerobic. We're focused solely on developing the aerobic conditioning. of the athletes, we're focused on recovering from those orange and red sessions that we just talked about. And we're focused on skills. We're focused on maybe talking about tactics and technical demands of the sport and a little bit of psychological. So there won't be any small-sided games or any of those endurance type games that we have on the red and the orange sessions. The coaches know that. They'll have solely a focus on maybe shooting, on passing, on executing the skills of the game. And there will be low intensity in those drills, essentially. So we might have a rudiment drill where we're just focusing on a basic skill. That could be shooting, passing, kicking. There's no other defender involved. There might be a passive defender, that's all. There won't be an active competitive element. A technical drill where we're focused on a movement skill, or we're focused on a part of the game, like a ball being kicked in, an athlete turning and putting it over the bar, or running into space, collecting it and scoring from a certain area. Or we might have a tactical drill where we would just repeat a single game kind of a movement pattern in the game that will happen typically, but it will be at low intensity. It's essentially like a walkthrough in rugby, or a team run in rugby, where you have no opposition. You're just going through the motions of what you will do in the game. And then in the gym, that will be only accessory lifts, only isometrics, probably more yielding isometrics than your overcoming isometrics, and maybe some med ball throws. So that's a recovery kind of focus day. We won't be getting under a bar. We won't be lifting too heavy. We'll be just doing enough so that we can recover in time to push the intensity again on the following day, which will be a red day probably, or an orange day. Then the last day of the lot is a yellow day, which is probably a little bit higher up than a green day, but there is not a high amount of volume in this session. It has to be kept to less than 50, 60 minutes. It's essentially a primer day. These are the days I throw in prior to the game, when we want to improve the technical and tactical aspects of the game, but we want the athletes to feel good going into the game. So we might do some flying sprints, but shorter ones. We might do some slow accelerations on that day, just to prime the nervous system before we go into the game. We might do some technical and tactical kind of drills and skills. There may be a defender in there, but the defender won't be working at 100% intensity. Unless it's a defensive focus drill, then the attacker might not be, etc. But again, we'll throw in the rudiment drills, the technical drills, and the tactical drills into that day, same as the green session, but we can go to a little bit of a higher intensity than we would on the green session. We just make sure to limit the volume of that session in terms of the minutes that we're on the pitch. On that day, we might go in and get the primer done post training session. Now, obviously, you want to get the primer done as close to 24 hours out from the game as possible. It's not always possible, and sometimes I think, would they benefit more on the game day from taking that day off prior to the game day and completely psychologically switching off and not coming up to the field than they would if they came up to the field, say on the Friday, did the primer, and then playing on the Saturday. At least they can switch off on the Friday if we do the primer on the Thursday. Now, it might be 48 hours or slightly less away from the game. It'll still probably have an impact on the game. And even so, at least I'm exposing the athletes to lifting things at lower load or lower intensity. So we're focused on movements that are of a higher velocity. So we're exposing them to those velocities of movement, which is important as well. So that's when we'll do our Olympic lifts if we're doing them. Not many of them do them at the moment. It's not that I'm opposed to them. They were doing them last year. I give them the option now whether they want to do weighted jump or Olympic lift, and I think most of them go for the weighted jump just because it's a lot simpler to set up. They can get it done quicker and then get out of there. So the primers typically should be taking a half an hour or less, and they usually are maybe 20 minutes even for some of them if they're efficient. They'll do their jumps, their hops, some med ball throws, and maybe some accessories on that day as well. Like, they love bicep curls. I'll throw in bicep curls all the time. They'll get them done. They actually fly through the session a lot faster when there's bicep curls at the end, because they're focused on getting to the stage of doing the bicep curls. If they want to skip them at the end, I don't mind at all. Typically they don't, though, and you'll see that in groups of male sports people a lot. They can be a little bit vain, but sure, a little bit of vanity is fine. Look good, feel good, play good. I think Kerwin and Flat used to say that the Argentina rugby team, when he was working with them, used to do arms the day before a game. It's not going to impact on their performance to a negative extent at all. It may even impact positively because they're going to feel confident, and confidence is key. That's what you're always doing as a coach, is you're trying to facilitate and improve your athletes' confidence in themselves and in their confidence to perform on game day and perform when it matters by exposing them to the same things during the week. Graded exposure to the stimulus will reduce the stress that occurs when presented with that stimulus or stimulus similar to it. So that's what we're doing in game day and in training sessions, is we're trying to get as close to what is going to happen on the field of play in the competitive environment as we can, and repeat those patterns and those actions over time so that the athletes can execute effectively on the game day. So that's basically the way that it works. Now, with that primer session, we might have a meeting post-training session on the Thursday at this stage of the season. So I'll leave them that primer session if they want to do it themselves on the Friday, or on the Saturday if we're playing on the Sunday, or on the Saturday in the morning if we're playing on the Saturday evening, whatever they want to do. At this stage of the season, we're focused mainly on retaining physical qualities and improving our performance of the actual sport, as opposed to developing physical qualities, which happened at the earlier stages of the season when we were pushing them quite hard. So at this stage of the season, as an S&C coach, you kind of need to take a step back a little bit. You work with the athletes that might be reintegrating back into the group after having a minor injury, etc. Or you may talk to the athletes and see how they're feeling and see if they need some individual care in terms of some programming or rehab, etc., to manage their niggles. And you can double up, I suppose, and try and improve their confidence themselves by just having conversations with them around how they're feeling, how they're performing. Just be someone to talk to, I suppose. You're a coach at the end of the day, so that's what you're there to do, is help the athlete. So any way you can help the athlete is what you're trying to facilitate. And then you're trying to help the coaches as well in terms of goal setting, in terms of being specific about what we need, in terms of communication, in terms of how positive or negative we're being with our team talks, etc., how we're talking to different athletes, and how much load that we're doing on the pitch. That's the number one thing as an S&C coach or a sports scientist, is you need to let the coaches know who's doing what, who you think probably needs to do a little bit more, who needs to do a little bit less, who we need to keep an eye on, etc., etc. And that's probably your role at this stage of the season, but you've got to be willing to take that back seat, get out of the passenger seat at this stage, take the back seat, and hopefully it all goes well on game day and you come away with a victory. So that's pretty much it for how I structure the week. It will vary week by week. We're in a kind of bi-weekly cycle because that's the way the games go in the senior championship. It's every 2 weeks. So we might have a green session, as I said, on the first session back. Then if they're sufficiently recovered, we'll push them to a red session the few days after that. If I feel like they're able to go close to max speed. If I don't, then we might put it orange. Then the next session, we'll have 2 days in between that. So that will probably be a red session because they have 2 down days or 2 recovery days, complete recovery. So I can push them a little bit harder there. Then on the following Tuesday, we might have a green session or a yellow session. And then the yellow session then on the Thursday will be the focus. I'll never have 2 reds close together. I'll never have as I said, maybe a red or an orange with only a day in between when it's occurred. So like if I have a red on a Tuesday, I'm not going to have another red on a Thursday because they've only had 1 day recovery. But I can have 2 yellows together. I can have 2 greens. I can have as many of them as I want. So I might have yellow, yellow. I might have green, green, depending on how the group is responding, depending on their acute to chronic work rate ratios. Or work ratios. What am I talking about? But yeah, lots of sciencey stuff in this episode. I know it's not for everybody, but it might help some coaches out there figure out what we're doing anyway, figure out how I think about the sport and how I think about the training in relation to Gaelic games. The only difference then in relation to the ladies is most of their games are played on a Wednesday, so they'll train on a Tuesday and a Friday. So that limits the amount of red sessions that we can do if they're playing every Wednesday, because I'm not going to have a red session 2 days after a game. I'm not going to have it 2 days before a game. So mainly with our red sessions, we would have done them in the preseason, early season, and then in our off weeks when we get maybe a bye week or when we have a week off from fixtures and competition. That's when we get those sessions in. And then we might, most days on a Monday is going to be a yellow session. On a Friday, I'll maybe get orange depending on how they're feeling, or it might be a green session if we're focused on recovery. And that's the only way that differs. The rest of the time, what I'm putting in terms of what they're doing in the gym, it's going to differ for the athletes, female and male, to an extent. But in terms of grouping what I'm going to do on those days, it's not going to change. I'm still going to do basically our heavy sessions on the red days and our heavy compounds. On the orange days, we can do compounds, but I won't put in any or many accessories. It'll be at a lower intensity to the red days. Green days, accessories, isos, med ball throws. Yellow days is a primer session. And then I might group the athletes in each team. So I might have each athlete in a group where maybe they might have a little bit more of a hamstring focus if that's an area where they have an injury history, maybe a shoulder focus if they've had some shoulder issues in the past. I'll always prescribe as well the volumes that they should do as a range, so they can do a certain amount of sets, quality over quantity all the time. So if you're feeling good, you can push it, you can do 4 or 5 sets. If you're not, then just get 2 sets done. I'm happy enough if they're 2 good sets. And then in relation to isos, etc., or prehab, even though I don't really like that term, they will have maybe a different focus. Say if I have grouped them for a hamstring group, a shoulder group, then we have a calf group as well. And then I also have a group that I push pretty hard in terms of volume load and in terms of volumes, and I might push them harder than the other groups. So that group is essentially the younger athletes that don't have as great an exposure to senior football, probably don't get the same amount of minutes, so I can push them hard and be a little bit more developmental with them. And then I have a group of maybe the older athletes that are focused on retaining physical qualities and just keeping injury at bay for the whole season. Those lads term themselves the hoppers, because I was giving them a lot of rudiment plyos in the early season to keep Achilles tendinopathy at bay. And I think we did so to a great extent, to be honest. A lot less incidents of that issue this season towards last season. As well as that, we reduced the risk of hamstring injuries, or the incidence of hamstring injuries this season as well, which was fantastic. Now, obviously, last season they didn't get a full preseason. I only came in halfway through the league as well, so I couldn't be as developmental with them. But we measured going into championship the incidence of injury towards last year going into championship, and we had a 66% reduction in the incidence of acute injuries, which was fantastic. So I'm happy enough we're making some positive changes anyway. Number one thing is winning on game day. So we'll keep the main thing, and we take a step back when we get to this stage of the season as S&C coaches. But Paddy Quinlan, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it wasn't too much rambling. I hope it was comprehensive and coherent enough that you could have some level of understanding of it anyway. And anybody else that's listening this far, I hope you have got something from that as well. Happy to help. If you have any questions, etc., then feel free to drop me a DM or drop me an email at peteyperformance@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to answer any additional questions. But I'll make these maybe a little bit more frequent, because I'm trying to add value to my audience, and the best way to do that is answer questions that they have. And provide value to their necessary or their problems that they're having. So yeah, hope you've enjoyed it. As always, if you did enjoy it, please remember to like it, share it, and send it. And that's it for today.